in that environment, it's it's much easier for the Russians to break through, to basically sneak past these infantry positions. They don't even kill them necessarily. They don't even try to take them or assault them. They just sneak past. And the reason that they fail most of the time to make these advances is because of the saturated net of Ukrainian drones who are also watching every square foot of that frontline area. But if there's enough of the Russians coming through, if they're sneaky enough, which is a lot easier when it's summer and there are a lot of leaves on the trees, then that becomes a big problem for Ukraine. And that's what happened in Pokrovsk.
So you say that at the moment the situation in Pokrovsk is probably irreversible. Do you know how many Russian troops are actually in the city at the moment?
Definitely in the hundreds. The general staff admitted to it being over 200.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are talking for the first time to award-winning journalist Francis Farrell from the Kyiv Independent. Francis began reporting full-time following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and has covered how soldiers on the front line and Ukrainians everywhere have been affected. Francis, welcome to Frontline. It's great to meet you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Francis, you've had another night of heavy drone and missile attacks on Kyiv, along with every other oblast in Ukraine. What's your experience of it? Because it makes big news in the papers over here, but it's par for the course, is it?
Yeah, so I must confess I slept through the last night, and that does happen, even with drones and with missiles. It is an every night activity at this point, and it's almost a kind of random roll of the dice. Whether you're woken up by these explosions, whether you're not. I guess I'm not necessarily the ideal Kyiv citizen when it comes to personal safety measures, maybe because I go to the front line a bit too much, but I value my sleep a little bit more than having to be just constantly have your schedule and your sleep schedule ruled by these Russian drones and missiles. But maybe that's not the right way, because just a week ago actually was the closest hit to my apartment. Just about 130 meters away. Some glass was knocked out in the building, not in my apartment itself. So I had to walk over that to get in and out. And just a friend down the road, it was right in their courtyard, and they had their windows blown out completely. So it is a daily reality. We are getting used to it. But of course, this is all happening in the context of, it seems like the balance between Russia's ability to launch these mass missile and drone attacks, their modifications of these missiles and drones, compared to Ukraine's quite overstretched network of air defense and supply of air defense missiles, does mean that we'll be in for a very, very tough winter. We've already gone back to blackouts schedules, and the even bigger problem, even though a lot of us have got generators, power stations at work, we're used to this. The bigger problem might be heating in the homes in cities like Kyiv. It's not come on yet. It's already getting a bit cold, and we're not sure, with some of these heating facilities being hit, if it will come on at all over the winter.
Yeah. And apologise, I didn't mean to be glib when I said it's par for the course. It's more a fact that it is a daily reality or a nightly reality for you in Ukraine at the moment. Let's talk, as you say, you have been to the front line. How many times have you been to the front line since you started reporting, since the full-scale invasion?
It's hard to count, probably about 20, 30 separate trips, I think, at least, usually about once every 2 months. So over 3 years, that's been quite a few.
That's plenty, yeah. And I'd like to get your thoughts about the most dynamic part of the front line at the moment, and this is the battle for Pokrovsk in Donetsk. Putin set his forces this deadline of mid-November to take the city. Where are we at the moment? What's the situation?
So the situation is pretty dire and pretty dynamic at the moment. This is not the first time that Russian soldiers have broken into the urban area of Pokrovsk. The first time was back in July, and that was just a few weeks after I was there for the last time, for sure, I think. And what happens here is that, maybe for context, I guess it's worth saying that this is a major kind of frontline city in the eastern Donbass region, which has held out despite being, I would say, probably the number one hotspot on the front line for the better part of last year, of the last year. It has held out all that time, despite immense pressure, immense Russian losses, trying to storm the city head on, also trying to surround it from both flanks. But the first time they managed to get in, it was a few dozen soldiers infiltrating past Ukrainian lines into the southern neighborhoods of this city. And at the time, it wasn't too many of them. It was just a few dozen. The rest of the front lines were still holding. This was just a small group that had literally snuck past. And then, with some very rapid response, with some elite kind of assault units being sent in, it's a very difficult job clearing Russian soldiers out from like an urban area. We're talking 9-story buildings, basements everywhere. But they managed, and the defense of the city continued. But now the same thing has happened, but just on a much larger scale, and in a way that it doesn't seem like it's reversible at this point. We had reports of Russian soldiers breaking into the city from, about 2 weeks ago. This is where we see evidence of a Ukrainian drone strike, for example, but suddenly those Russians are a lot further than we thought they were before. And then those videos, more and more of them kept coming out, even deeper into the city. And just a week ago, there was a video of Russian soldiers having shot dead a few civilians near the railway station of Pokrovsk. And of course, it made headlines as a horrifying war crime, which it was, but it was also a warning sign that something's going wrong with the defense of this city.
I understand that President Putin maybe is making some kind of an offer to allow journalists in at this stage, and to promise that there will be no attacks during this time. What do you make of that?
Quite bizarre, honestly. There's no other way to say this. This is really, I mean, and it's also worth pointing out that this is coming on the back of at least 3 recent incidents of journalists being either killed or injured by Russian drones on the front line, including a friend of mine who lost his leg, while his colleague, the French photographer, was actually killed. And also, it was an offer made for what? He said so the journalists could come in and speak to Ukrainian soldiers and convince themselves that they are surrounded. It's not the case. They aren't surrounded yet, although there is a danger of that. But as for this strange offer, and especially, to trust that the Russians will stop firing at everything that moves, whether it's a soldier, civilian, or journalist, it's just absurd, really.
You don't know of anyone taking him up on that offer, do you?
No.
Absolutely not. No. When you said earlier that the Russian troops advancing just literally snuck past, can you describe what happens?
Yeah, so it's important to understand, because we see the front line moving on the map. We see, maybe some kind of surface level news reports of the Russians have advanced here, that they've made so and so amount of gains. But in reality, it's important to understand that the tactical context in which this is happening is very different from what it was even a year ago. Even a year ago, the front line, the idea of a front line actually meant something. There were infantry positions on both sides, and the Russians would be advancing forward using, of course, artillery and drone cover to try and take those frontline positions and then advance further. Now we're in a situation where 2 major factors have changed this completely. A is the very dire shortage of frontline infantry on the Ukrainian side. And, this means that where it used to be, for example, 50 people or maybe even more, 100, that were defending 1 kilometer of front line, just as an example. Now it's more like less than 10. So it's more like, instead of having a front line where you've got a string of positions that are all, coordinating and in contact with each other, now it's more like two guys in a hole here, and then a few hundred meters further down, another two guys in a hole, and then a few hundred meters further down. And so that leaves these huge gaps between the frontline positions. And the second factor, and these are both very interrelated, the reason also why Ukraine is so short on infantry, it's not only just because they're not mobilizing enough, they're not dragging enough people off the street, or however it's often portrayed. The bigger problem is more on the end of the battlefield, in terms of how much deadlier it has gotten over the last year. So even a year ago on the battlefield, there were lots of FPV drones in the air. There were lots of small drones dropping bombs on infantry. And it was very dangerous to be very close. But even then, given that level of risk, it was still possible to drive up pretty close to the actual front line, the actual zero line. I did that to do a story about the zero line, about infantry, last summer, and it was still possible. You drive up, you go for a little walk, and there's your front line. Now, none of that's possible. So now, not only the saturation of drones in the air is so much higher that vehicles cannot get anywhere near as close as they could before. Now, even 10 kilometers away, or 15, like 10 miles away, that's an area where most vehicles are being hit by drones in a few minutes. And then, the closer you get, the more deadlier it is for anything that's moving. And so these infantrymen are walking often 15 kilometers by foot with all their stuff to get to the front line. And the really miserable thing is they're often staying there for months at a time, and they're not even able to really put their head out and actually do some fighting if the Russians are coming, because then they'll be seen and they'll be hit by everything the Russians have. So in that environment, to finally get to the end of your question, in that environment, it's very, very, it's much easier for the Russians to break through, to basically sneak past these infantry positions. They don't even kill them necessarily. They don't even try to take them or assault them. They just sneak past. And the reason that they fail most of the time to make these advances is because of the saturated net of Ukrainian drones, who are also watching every square foot of that frontline area. But if there's enough of the Russians coming through, if they're sneaky enough, which is a lot easier when it's summer and there are a lot of leaves on the trees, then that becomes a big problem for Ukraine. And that's what happened in Pokrovsk.
So you say that at the moment the situation in Pokrovsk is probably irreversible. Do you know how many Russian troops are actually in the city at the moment?
Definitely in the hundreds. The general staff admitted to it being over 200 a few days ago. And since then, unfortunately, because it's not only the problem of them sneaking around in the city, but the problem of the entrance to that city from the south has now been opened up, and they can just keep flowing in. Unfortunately, the situation.
So what are they actually doing when is there actual fighting in Pokrovsk itself, in the city itself?
Yeah, so what they do is, once they go in, if they make it past these infantry positions, once they're inside an urban area, like Pokrovsk, we're talking high-rise, 9-story buildings, also smaller houses, a lot of basement areas, industrial zones. There's just a lot of places to hide, and very slowly, make your way through the city. Drones are trying to watch everything and keep up, but it just doesn't become possible anymore. And a big reason for that is because the Ukrainian drone units, they need a stable place to work. They are working from maybe 3-5 kilometers back from the front line normally. But once you have an uncontrollable situation of the Russians starting to seep through your front lines, it won't be long before they'll be walking around right right next door and maybe assaulting you, maybe ambushing you directly. And that means that you need to withdraw quite chaotically. And that means you're not going to be able to do your work as a drone unit to stop more Russians coming in. And it just kind of snowballs at that point.
So is there a point at which the Ukrainian forces will have to make that call to withdraw, or is it? I mean, how does that actually work in this kind of warfare?
Yeah, absolutely. Just like in any kind of warfare, if you have those people who are ostensibly following orders out there, and if their position is untenable, if there is a threat of an encirclement, which unfortunately there is now, then you would expect that the higher command would eventually cut their losses and say this is definitely no longer a favorable attritional fight for us to try and hold this city. As good as a job it did of being a fortress for over a year, it's no longer that. The enemy is overrunning the battlements, and it's time to go. But the problem is, unfortunately, with this Ukrainian command, that consistently over this war, if we look at the Battle of Bakhmut, of Avdiivka, several other cities which were basically almost surrounded, and the Ukrainian command refused to give a timely order to withdraw. The same goes for the salient in Kursk Oblast in Russia. That is a big concern now, because not only has it reached a point where a withdrawal will be chaotic and quite deadly, to be honest, even at this point. But on top of that, this is an environment of more drone saturation than we saw in those previous battles. So,
because that's what I was wondering, was how do you do a withdrawal when you've got that heavy drone saturation that you've been describing? I mean, it sounds like the most deadliest way to withdraw that you could possibly have.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, the crazy thing is that this drone saturation was so high around Pokrovsk already for the past month or two. Like it reached this kind of critical level that very few vehicles were going in at all. And so they were doing, soldiers were going in on foot, and they were being resupplied by drones. Some heavy bomber drones in the air, and some on the ground, like these kind of ground robots that you might have seen. And so that will also be the same for the withdrawal. We'll see the withdrawal mostly happening on foot. I don't think many vehicles are going to be getting in and out of that gauntlet of drones. And that has its advantages and disadvantages. It means that you can also try and be as sneaky as possible to survive, but it's also just a very, very arduous and extremely deadly journey to make on foot.
Am I right in thinking that the onset of winter was just too late to help this part of the front line?
Yeah, I mean, winter is obviously more favorable for defense in this kind of drone-dominated war, because it's a lot more difficult to hide, especially in these tree lines, in these forests. Everyone's thermal signature is a lot stronger in the thermal cameras as well, compared to the landscape around them. And in general, it should be, as it was last year, we saw a stabilization of the front line. It should be a lot more difficult for the Russians to conduct these kind of infiltration-based attacks. But if we look around at the moment, yes, the problem is that there are still leaves on the tree. A lot of them are falling at the moment. But there's another factor here as well, is that, once the Russian drone and artillery and glide bomb, all of these fire assets, once they understand that the Ukrainian infantry is less and less there, it's playing less and less of a role, then it makes sense for them to start focusing their efforts on the Ukrainian drone teams, on hunting them, on finding their positions, their antennas, their dugouts where the guys are working out of. Hitting their logistics, going back and forth along key roads. And if the Russians can degrade Ukrainian drone assets enough, that suddenly again makes it a lot easier for the Russian infantry to start making it through.
And how big a prize would Pokrovsk be to the Russians?
Well, I mean, I think Pokrovsk. It's important to understand this fight for Donbass. It's been like politicized a lot, um, and Putin was like very crafty, I guess, in reducing his demands to Trump, saying, okay, we don't need all of Zaporizhia and Kherson, which are huge areas which we're nowhere near taking, and we focus on Donbass. And basically, what that means is that it creates conditions where it seems like he's being more reasonable, but actually what he's still asking from the Ukrainians is still completely unacceptable. It's still hundreds of people being handed over into Russian occupation. It's still, your best lines of defense just being handed over, all in exchange for a ceasefire, for a promise that Russia won't attack again. The real context in which this is happening is a larger war of attrition between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia is looking to degrade Ukraine's capacity to defend more than their own capacity to attack is being degraded. It's a large numbers game, and Ukraine and both sides have the opportunity to concentrate forces here or there, prioritize this or that territory. And in this context, I would say that Pokrovsk has done its job for Ukraine as being this fortress, which has really, ground up a lot of the Russian attacking potential, especially over 2025, a year where, broadly politically, Ukraine was always going to have it really tough. The question now, of course, is one of smart decision making. Is there going to be a withdrawal order in time? Is there going to be have there been well defended, well prepared lines of defense built behind Pokrovsk in advance, for that to happen? That's been an issue which the Ukrainians have consistently really underperformed in, and has caused real big problems on the front line. So all of these things come into play, but for now, if we just put a bookend on this battle now, although it's not over, I would say that it has done its job.
And you've just written a piece based on your recent trip to the front line at Kupiansk. What is the importance of recapturing that city, or recapturing for the Russians?
So once again, it's all part of a larger attritional battle. Kupiansk, unfortunately, is a really painful one because it was liberated in advance. It was liberated 3 years ago by Ukrainian forces, and it's now likely to be the largest city so far that was once liberated and then occupied again. And of course, when we say occupied again now, that comes with the city being destroyed. It wasn't a quick occupation like it was the first time. Difficult to imagine this city, along with those in the Donbass, as having much of a future. But beyond that, it's much less out of control. It's much less dynamic. It has some similar tactical elements to Pokrovsk, but for now, there's no danger of some kind of large-scale encirclement of Ukrainian soldiers. The brigades there are fighting hard, but they know where the Russians are. They know where their troops are, and they're causing a lot of losses. Overall, of course, they do want to dig in on the other side of this major river, the Oskil, which they crossed a few months ago, where the city center of Kupiansk is located. But they've not so far, and they don't look close to making enough of a presence on the other side of the river where they can start taking logistics across and so on. So it has been a hotspot, but nowhere near as critical.
And you write about the Ukrainian drone operators picking off the enemy as they advance, and the kind of challenges they face, but also about the kind of discrepancies in the way that the different brigades are equipped. Can you tell me a bit about that and why there is such a difference?
Yeah, so there's a huge discrepancy, and it's one of the main things to understand about why the Russians advance here or fail to advance in another direction. Ukraine has its main ground forces, where there are many mechanized brigades. I guess that's the most standard bread and butter Ukrainian brigade. But some of them have existed for 10 years. They've got lots of history. They've got lots of resources. They've got a strong kind of core of officers. And you compare that to a newly formed brigade, which is, really just kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel for some kind of old Soviet trained officers, mobilized personnel, mostly whatever equipment we can find in storage or that we're getting across from the West. And a lot of the combat potential and the survivability of these brigades also relies a lot on volunteers, on crowdfunding for really basic things like cars, for drones, Starlinks, like really basic things which you need to stay in the fight. And then you have your very famous elite brigades, the National Guard, Azov, the specialized drone units, which get a lot of resources from the state, the new assault forces, which is a favorite of the new commander-in-chief, for better or for worse. And, meanwhile, the very, very standard brigades, maybe they've not been formed too long ago. They've tried to crowdfund for basic cars and drones. They're full of mobilized personnel. None of them are really volunteers. And, when you compare the sector held by a brigade like that to a sector held by a much stronger brigade, then it makes sense. Where's that weak point going to be? Where the Russians are going to understand that it makes more sense for them to target. And unfortunately, what we see is the Russians targeting a weak brigade, maybe targeting the moment where they're rotating, trying to make a little mini breakthrough. And if they manage, that then compromises the defensive lines of the stronger brigades next to it, because suddenly, they've got Russians on their flanks.
And you also give quite a vivid picture of the pressures to supply drones, right from the workshop straight to the front line. Can you just describe how that is being conducted exactly?
Yeah, so I mean, it's gotten a lot better. It's gotten a lot more systemized than it was at the start, because at the start it truly was grassroots. It was people, volunteers, making these drones in their garages and trying to get them to the soldiers. But now we've got this drone warfare, and here I guess we're talking mostly about the FPV drones. So these are the single-use kamikaze drones, which you can put together from a lot of parts widely available. At first, they were mostly Chinese parts. Now they're mostly Ukrainian. And we've got some big manufacturers in Ukraine just pumping these out, thousands at a time, thousands per day, much more. And these are all, in theory, high precision weapons, at the cost of about 10% of your standard NATO artillery shell. So that stable flow of drones to the front line is there. We don't need to rely on volunteers for that as much. Unfortunately, sometimes there's quality issues, and the brigades in the field, they need to set up a big workshop where they check every drone and kind of resolder it. But then it gets more difficult with the reconnaissance drones, with the Mavic drones, these Chinese civilian off-the-shelf drones, which do a lot of the work on the front line, because they're the ones constantly providing that reconnaissance, also dropping the bombs, which is these small bombs, which is actually responsible for a very high percentage of Russian casualties, and on top of that, you need trained pilots. You need a lot of extra equipment as well. It makes a big difference whether you have a team and equipment which are basically high enough quality to fly further, to kind of beat Russian jamming efforts, and that could be the difference between a team that is actually competent and able to do their work on the front line, and a team that's constantly not got enough drones, not got their best equipment, and are not able to do the work. And that also speaks about that discrepancy within the Ukrainian military.
And also, you point out that the pressures that around the Kupiansk area that you witnessed of Ukrainian forces also having to defend their resupply routes as well because of Russian loitering drones.
Yeah, so I mean, there's this sometimes stereotype that Ukraine is the only one innovating, and they're just always smarter when it comes to drone warfare. Often, what the Russians do is they copy a Ukrainian innovation and then upscale it. But when it comes to these kind of drones, you have to give them credit. They came up with this first. These are drones on fiber optic cable, usually used for these ambushes. Which means that they can sit there for hours and hours, for a long time along key roads or logistics routes. They usually don't have to wait that long, and they just sit there and watch. And then, as soon as a vehicle passes, they rise up into the air and hit that vehicle. And so, Ukraine.
How long can they be? Sorry to interrupt. How long can they be loitering for?
Well, they're on the ground. That's the thing. They're waiting on the ground. So they're not using any power apart from the very small amount of battery power needed to continue to send the video signal along the fiber optic cable. And yeah, they just sit there. They've got little legs for 3D printed on them, so that they can just sit and wait. And yeah, they call them these waiting drones. And it's now they first kind of showed up at the beginning of the year. And now it's, as you said, so much of a problem that Ukrainians are redirecting some of their drone teams to clear their own logistics routes from these ambush drones.
It must be extremely difficult to get close enough to report on any of this.
Yes, and it's getting more and more difficult with every month. I think in the future, over 2026, we will be basically watching the war just from screens, from command posts, doing interviews in the rear. Unfortunately, at least in this war, I think you could say some kind of, well, it sounds a bit weird to say, but like some kind of golden age of war reporting is certainly over in this respect, because once again, the area where anything that moves can and will be hit within a few minutes by a high precision drone is just getting deeper and deeper, kind of behind the front line. Large newspapers, large American newspapers, journalists from there, they tell me that according to their protocols, they've just stopped going completely. Which is dangerous, because then you just don't know what's going on. We're still trying to go. I went, my last trip was less than a month ago, and the next one will be soon. So we're still trying to do this, use our local knowledge, kind of stay low and work with soldiers that we trust. But it is becoming, of course, more and more of a lottery.
But you also written recently a piece about the lessons learned from Dobropilya. Can you just tell us, it's about the Russian breach into Dobropilya. Can you just tell us what those lessons are?
So Dobropilya, we talked about Pokrovsk as an example of this infiltration tactic working. Dobropilya was the same thing, except it wasn't in breaking into an urban area, but what it was them pushing as deep as possible, and they made it. This was in August, around the time of the Alaska summit with Putin. And again, this is hundreds of Russian soldiers, but it's important to understand they're working in groups of, 1, 2, or 3 maximum, really just focusing on sneaking past the Ukrainian lines, trying to go as deep as possible to create as much chaos as possible. And it was so bad that they'd made it so far in just a few days. The military was trying to say, no, it's just a few dozen sabotage groups or something like that, and they'll soon be cleared. But once it was clear how far they really made it, and once this kind of open source mapping project drew these red lines on the map to show the Russian progress, it's a whole other topic about the role that these maps play in the war. That's when the Kyiv and the whole country understood that this could threaten to end Ukraine's hold of Donetsk Oblast completely, and that's where they responded really strongly, throwing some of the strongest units, assault units, Azov, to try and clear this breach, and they did. They stabilized the area within a few weeks. Took back those villages that had been overrun. Some were holding out for quite a long time until just a few days ago, and they've been cleared now. But in the meantime, again, the front line is overstretched, and you can't have your best units everywhere. And in the meantime, we've seen, it's hard to say exactly what was the cause of what, but we've seen Russian advances, picking up the pace in other areas. And as I wrote in that article, I don't think that we'll see something like that over winter, because, as we mentioned, how it makes it more difficult to do that kind of thing. But we will see the Russians trying to do it next year, in spring and summer, when the weather gets better, the leaves are back on the trees, and it will be a real big challenge.
And where do you expect Russia to concentrate its efforts? Because, for example, the diplomatic editor of the Times suspects Moscow's mobilization target for 2025 indicates a plan to go for the so-called fortress belt to open up the east and then central Ukraine.
It makes sense. It makes sense that Donbass is their target. But again, it's a broader war of attrition, and it will also create dilemmas for Ukraine, where to defend. And it makes it also, the logic makes sense that if Ukraine, is as deadly bent on holding Donbass at all costs, then they will open up other areas. If they prioritize that too much with too many strong units, they will open up other areas and leave them less protected. And we're already seeing that actually on the front line. Southwest of Pokrovsk is where the Russians have broken into a new region of Ukraine, Dnipropetrovsk region. And down there, it's just a lot of endless wide steppe with some rivers running through them, no like major cities so far. And so it's kind of gone underneath the headlines and not really being noticed. But we see that the Russians are actually making the most gains by square kilometer in that area. And that's because Ukraine has deprioritized the defense of it, trying to hold on to Dobropilya, to Pokrovsk, to Kupiansk. So, we can talk about political aims of getting or keeping this or that territory, but if one side prioritizes one area too much, that leaves another area undefended.
And how do you decide where you go when you want to report?
Well, it's usually
Is it a case of where you can go?
Yeah. It's usually the hotspots. So it's usually the Donbass, Donetsk Oblast areas, and here some considerations are also given to where we know we can get access. Which brigades we can reach out to. Next time, I think we might go to this Dnipropetrovsk area. It might be more challenging to work there because the Russians are moving forward quicker, which means that they're less keen to take you and show you what's going on. But another thing that we want to look into.
Are you going to, sorry to interrupt you, Francis, but you're going to keep going as long as you possibly can, physically go?
Yeah. It's important because otherwise, the map, the war, which is constantly changing and dynamic, it kind of just fades into these very vague descriptions of Russia making incremental gains in the front line. Nothing's really moving. No side can win, which really ignores the reality of this brutal war of attrition, where things can speed up or slow down very quickly.
Is there a part of the war reporting that you think needs more attention that hasn't had enough so far?
Well, I think it's just important to connect what's going on the front line to the broader understanding of how this war could end in general, because for the war to end, it's Russia that needs to make the decision to stop. Right? They need to say we've had enough. And the worst case scenario is Ukraine suing for peace, the balance of power being in Russia's favor, and Trump and so on pressuring Ukraine to basically capitulate, and Russia saying, well, what are you willing to give me to make me stop? And what Ukraine wants is to make Russia stop, to make Russia understand that they've taken so much, but they can't take any more. This war is getting too costly for them. They need to, mass mobilize. They can't pay their soldiers, and that seems far away. But that's the point where Putin could come to the understanding that he's had enough. He's ready to stop and at least be satisfied with a ceasefire, with what he's got so far. But the problem is, in all of this discussion, even that reality is often looked over when we're talking about vague security guarantees. But on top of that, people take the stability of the front line for granted. And they describe it vaguely. They say, it's not really going anywhere, incremental gains and so on. Where, as we've talked about today, that all of these little factors really decide whether we have a stable and static or a dynamic and chaotic one. And for Ukraine, the strongest card they can have going into future negotiations is a rock solid, stable defense. Russia might make some small gains, but it always comes at a huge and unsustainable cost. Whereas Russia's strongest card they can have is a defense that is kind of collapsing and falling apart. And as we've seen around Pokrovsk and Dobropilya, we're really kind of in between those two states. And so it's important to understand what's actually going on, because that will affect how this war will end.
Yes. Which really underlines the importance of getting accurate reporting from the situation on the front line, because when you can't even get it within the military to their superiors, I mean, the opportunities to manipulate the truth, especially when you talk of ceasefires and negotiations, can change everything.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just a question to be put to anyone who is saying something or about this war, commentating on it, analyzing it, or God forbid, actually making decisions. How in touch are you with the actual reality on the front line? And even among the analytical community, among media, among government, there's just such an information gap and an understanding gap that's often visible.
As you see the situation as it is today, how much longer do you see the war continuing for?
Well, I think considering the tactical changes, considering the dire manpower shortage on the Ukrainian side, but also the high losses that Russia is taking, still ultimately the main factor is manpower, especially on the Russian side. So the question is, if we reach a point, I think we're definitely going to see the war continue into spring and summer next year, where Russia will most certainly try, up the ante to really overrun the Ukrainian defense, and probably lose a lot of people in that attempt. And so that it depends on those battles in spring and summer, if the defense can hold or really start to fall apart on the Ukrainian side, and that in turn will be the biggest factor going into some kind of a political settlement on this war. The better case scenario is that Russia throws everything at it. Ukraine's defense holds. Russia's losses mount to a point where they simply they cannot replace that manpower anymore. People are not signing up for the Russian army at the same rate, and then Putin will be placed with a very difficult decision for himself. I think he could easily mobilize if he wanted to, but he clearly doesn't want to do it. He'd rather pay them more and more. And then there's the other question: the international pressure, the economy, the oil refineries, the deep strikes. It all comes down, unfortunately, to the psychology of one man and whether there can be enough evidence on the table and enough strength, both from Ukraine and from partners, both economically, politically, and first and foremost on the front line that makes him decide, yep, that's enough. I want to stop.
And Francis, just finally, you're facing perhaps the hardest, toughest winter since the full-scale invasion, and there are sustained and repeated attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. What is the morale like at the moment in the country?
I think when it comes to blackouts and energy, it's going to be really tough. If the heating really doesn't come on, then it will be tougher than before. But that's on the level of the civilian population. That's something that they're used to. It's almost a reminder sometimes of the existential fight that's being fought. The bigger internal tension is about mobilization, which is a whole separate topic, and the soldiers, expecting to just continue to fight until the end of the war. But to speak on a country level, or whether we're talking about the military or civilians, overall, people are tired, people are exhausted, people want peace, but they also understand that at the moment, the only alternative to continuing the struggle is capitulation, and with that, annihilation of independent Ukraine, most likely. So we keep going.
Thank you very much, Francis. I'm sure our viewers will be very grateful to have had your insight into what's happening, especially around the front lines. Thank you for your time.
Cheers. It was a pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.